Hello, and welcome to the lecture on realism, covering the stories The Necklace and The Garden Party. In this lecture, I will be introducing you to terms like realism, external and internal conflict, as well as imagery, and our discussion related to the two stories, The Necklace and The Garden Party. In our previous unit, we looked at typical characteristics of the literary hero. And now we're going to move on to a discussion of the different modes of literature. Over the next 4 weeks, we will read short stories by a variety of authors. Each story has a different use of narrative, or to put it another way, the author has chosen to write in a different mode. A mode is best defined as a way of writing that demonstrates a particular perspective of how the author or characters view reality. The typical division in literature is between realism and fantasy, but there are many variations between these opposite modes. This week, we begin at one end of the spectrum with realism. When authors write in the realistic mode, they try to create a story that feels as true to life as possible. This means they will try to show you places and people that you will recognize from your own experiences, even if you're from a different cultural background. Authors that use realism often want the story to feel true, even if the events of the story may seem unusual. Our stories this week, The Necklace and The Garden Party, are examples of realism because they stay in the real world. Nothing supernatural or too unbelievable occurs, even though the action they describe does not happen every day. In general, keep these principles in mind as we study realism. Number 1. Realist stories do not typically use the supernatural. Number 2, realist authors like to write about the day-to-day lives of ordinary people in order to show how real life actually happens, or what the consequences are when people make decisions in the real world. Number 3, many realist stories deal with a character's or the hero's psychology to show how people think and react to events during their lives. Number 4, most realist literature is serious, meaning that it is meant to be dramatic, tragic, or even disturbing. It often deals with death, hardship, poverty, oppression, ordinary lives, problems in relationships, and the hero's problems with himself or herself, society, and others. Number 5, realism is the dominant, or considered to be the most important, literary tradition. This week, we read 2 short stories that have similar themes. Both are written in a realist mode, and both deal with class distinctions, wealth, poverty, and the consequences for decisions in real life. We will compare the use of realism in these stories and examine the way the authors use realism to convey a message in these texts. Let's start with The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. Guy de Maupassant is a 19th century French writer who was a student of the High Realism movement in French literature. He was befriended by one of France's most famous realist authors, Gustave Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary. Maupassant is considered to be a master of the short story, which was a relatively new genre in the 19th century. While he did write some stories that use the supernatural, he is best known for his realist work. Remember, this means that the events of the story are focused on the everyday. However, Maupassant also liked to write stories that were driven by unique plots, sometimes resulting in twist endings. The Necklace is an example of this type of story. The Necklace was published in 1884. The story is relatively concise. A woman with high social aspirations is too poor to achieve them. The realism of this story occurs through the juxtaposition of internal and external conflict. Ancient literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, usually focuses on conflict that emerges from outside the hero's psyche. This means that the hero encounters a problem from the outside of him or herself and has to resolve it through action like a quest. Modern literature, like The Necklace, usually examines how a character deals with a problem that begins in the mind. The story will emphasize what a character thinks and then show how what they think affects the action of the story. In The Necklace, the internal conflict begins with Mrs. Loisel's dissatisfaction with her life. The narrator tells us that she was unhappy and felt that her beauty and charms were wasted because she didn't have any money. Basically, she wants to be rich and famous, but she doesn't have the family or social connections to make this happen. Does this sound realistic? The realism of this story begins with the problem of someone who isn't content with what they are born into. If Mrs. Loisel was content, there would be no story. Maupassant creates a plot based out of this very realistic internal problem. The plot escalates when Mrs. Loisel finally gets an invitation to an exclusive party, but she is still not content. It's not enough to be around all the rich and famous people that she craves. She has to look the part. This vanity leads her to purchase expensive clothes and to borrow a diamond necklace from a friend. The necklace is the story's title because it is the center of the conflict. The internal conflict of Mrs. Loisel's vanity thus becomes an external conflict because she loses the necklace at the party. Typically, in the realist mode, the characters must compromise with the world at large, either by submitting to a social order, as in a happy ending like a wedding, or by having the world and environment defeat them, which we can see in the necklace. This type of literature emphasizes the individual's psychology and struggle, but also the way the individual cannot escape their role within the larger community and/or cultural expectations. Think about how the characters' fates either fall into the realist tradition or not, whether you think this story is realistic or not. Now let's look at your second story, The Garden Party by Katherine Mansfield. The second story was written by Katherine Mansfield and was published in 1922. Mansfield was born in New Zealand and was a British citizen. She is also considered to be a master of the short story and of the realist tradition. You'll notice that The Garden Party has similar themes to The Necklace, such as the internal conflict based on social class. In this case, though, we get a story from the point of view of the upper class. Laura, at the story's beginning, interacts with the working class as they help prepare for the garden party referenced in the title. Laura's attitude tells us that she has benevolent feelings for people not in her social class, but we can also see the way that her comments contain a somewhat condescending attitude. Consider, for example, the part of the story where the workman leans over and smells the lavender. Laura's response is to wonder at him for caring for things like that. In her world, workman would not be aware of beauty and flowers, and his actions surprise her. Again, we see realism at work in this story through the internal psychology of the character. Laura's attitude was certainly realistic in the early 20th century, and probably still is today. Can we imagine people having judgments about social class like Laura does? And what happens when those judgments are tested through whether or not they should have a party after a poorer neighbor dies? That's what this story is exploring. We inhabit Laura's mind and are therefore forced to deal with this dilemma, one that may exist in the real world, even if the circumstances are unusual. Another narrative technique realists use is imagery. In the realist mode, authors use details like description of minute elements and of the environment to create a real feel for you as you read. We can see an example of this during the description of Laura's journey to the Scots house. Mansfield describes the clothing people wear, the way the lights and shadows look, and details like a newspaper sitting at a woman's feet. All of these things work together to create a real picture in your mind as you read. Ultimately, realist stories usually work didactically. Remember, didactic literature is one that tries to teach the reader through the events of the story. This does not mean that the lesson is always an obvious one, but it means that the story is serious and tries to get the reader thinking about the issues or consequences raised by the action of the story. So what lessons do you think we can learn from The Necklace and The Garden Party? Are they the same lesson, or can we see different ones? Thanks.